Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Expedition Wednesday live stream. My name is Damon Stanwell-Smith, and I am the Head of Science and Sustainability at Viking Expeditions. And this is our fourth episode of Expedition Wednesdays. So for those that have tuned in before, you may recall that on the 19th of August, Jørn Henriksen, our Director of Expeditions, and myself had a conversation about our past and about our motivations and enthusiasm about Viking expeditions. Our second episode, Jørn interviewed Thor Heyerdahl Jr. on the 26th of August about his extraordinary father and the adventures that he's had. Our third episode was an interview with Benedict Ingstad on the 2nd of September about Lancer Meadow and the Vikings' exploration of North America. And now for our fourth episode, we're going to be going behind the scenes to look at how Viking expeditions are being planned and developed and prepared. And we're going to concentrate on kayaking, expeditionary kayaking this evening. And I'm delighted to be introducing and welcoming to Viking.TV my friend and colleague, Aaron Lawton. He is Viking's Expedition Operations Manager and also a kayak specialist. So, Aaron, welcome to Viking.TV.
Thank you, Damon. I'm delighted to be here.
So, we're going to be talking about all things kayak over the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. However, I do know that you've had a very interesting career to date, and everybody has to start somewhere. And I wonder how you first got involved in tourism and tourism management.
It's a great question, and interestingly enough, it didn't start off with kayaks or boats on the water. It started off with a set of bagpipes, believe it or not. I started playing the pipes when I was 11, and as a youngster growing up in Nova Scotia, it seemed like the right thing to do. And I got a job as a 15-year-old piping at the Halifax Citadel National Historic Site. I was a reenactor, or a historical animator, as we called them. And I was part of the 78th Mackenzie Highlanders. You can see my pipe band here up on the screen, and I'm the piper second from the right. So a proud 15-year-old piper in the 78th Mackenzie Highlanders, learning the drill of the 1860s, but also learning the role of the Highland Regiment of the Halifax Citadel in really the role of the city of Halifax as it developed, and so having tourists come up to the city. To the Citadel on a daily basis, interacting with them, answering their questions. Of course, I enjoyed playing the pipes for them, but I found I got as much pleasure out of talking to them and answering their questions about the history and about the city itself, becoming a bit of a tour guide. And it was a blast. It was a great job. I piped up there for 3 summers. And perhaps that was my first interaction with the cruise industry, as well as the cruise ships would come into Halifax and visit the Citadel. We'll be doing that on our Canadian Discovery or Discover Canada voyage from New York to Toronto, stopping in Halifax, and Viking Ocean as well has Halifax as one of its stopping points.
Fantastic. And from Halifax, I understand that your piping took you further afield.
Well, I think it moved after leaving the Citadel. It moved from the job of piping to more of a hobby. And I went off to university, and a summer job in university was a bit of a dream job for a canoeist and kayaker. I got a job at a lodge in central Ontario, north central Ontario, on the top end of Georgian Bay, a place called Killarney Mountain Lodge. And I like to think that I got the job based on my kayaking skills and great interview technique as a 18 or 19, maybe 20-year-old. But really, I think the owner of the lodge was also intrigued by the fact that I was a piper, and he had a lodge band, and there's a picture of me playing with the lodge band in the Carousel Lounge at Killarney Mountain Lodge. And my day job was as the manager of the outfitters, Killarney Outfitters, which was owned by Killarney Mountain Lodge, and then I would get called into, or occasionally called in to play with the lodge band in the evening and entertain the guests of the lodge. And part of that is that interaction, but it's also, being around the lodge and talking to the guests, getting them excited about the areas outside the lodge. As you know, we're Georgian Bay, and Killarney plays a role in our Great Lakes program. So absolutely.
And I'd like to pick up actually on you mentioned that you're with an outfitters. Now, as a Brit, I hear the word outfitters and I think of the Hudson Bay Company and trappers and adventurers in Canadian North. Could you, for our viewers, and especially our viewers that are not North American, share about what an outfitter does?
Yeah, so outfitting has changed over time, and I suppose I was there during the transition of that change. But an outfitting business traditionally it's a canoe and kayak rental shop. So people will show up, they'll rent a canoe and kayak for the day. We provide them paddles, life jackets. Generally, if we want our canoe back or kayaks back in one piece, we provide them a few tips on how to safely operate. A lot of people do have the skills, they just don't have the place to store their own boat. But it ranges from that to providing a full guiding package where I would go out on a trip, 2-night to a 5 or 6 night trip on Georgian Bay or into the park with clients and cook for them, help them set up their tents, teach them the basics of camping. I had a classic, what we called the complete outfitting package. And that was a classic, a German tourist showed up at Toronto, rented a car, drove up to Killarney with a beautiful, sleek aluminum carry-on case. And he showed up late afternoon, and we had all the gear packed, the menu chosen, packed, all the food packed. We unpacked everything for him and showed him where everything was, how to use a stove, how to set up the tent. We had a bag ready for his personal gear to go in. He left the aluminum carry-on case with us and put his gear into a waterproof bag in a knapsack. And we gave him a map with the campsites marked as to where he'd be going, and even a few tips on which sites, where to set their tent up in the sites, and then off they went. And that was really, that was the one extent of the outfitting. And so it was really interesting to interact again. You had the ability to see people's skills, their interests, and then gauge the product that you wanted to deliver to them or the information you wanted to portray. Some were just, give me the canoe, I'm an expert, and some, you've paddled in this park 100 times, give me the goods. And it was great.
It's core skills for running expeditions, I think, with expedition cruising.
Yeah, certainly.
And I'm actually looking over your right shoulder, and I can see, and I'm knowing you, that, anything with paddles, oars, blades is something you're good at propelling. And I guess you self-identify as a waterman. Did it start with kayaking, or as I said, there's blades just over your shoulder there?
Yeah, those are two Greenland kayak paddles, and interesting, they're slightly different shapes, and due to the sort of the height restrictions in my office, it can't quite see the whole paddle, but the slightly different blades are interesting because they're from different regions. One's from Northwest Greenland and one's from Southwest Greenland. And that really, the narrower paddler is from Northwest, where there's less availability of driftwood. So making a paddle out of smaller pieces of driftwood. Southern Greenland has a bit more driftwood in it, and just due to ocean currents. And I love the variants of the kayaks, of the craft, but also of the paddles. I grew up family canoe tripping. I remember escaping. My dad was a camp director in the summers, escaping from him in the shallows in a canoe on a small lake, and him chasing me through the shallows, sort of knee deep in mud, trying to get the canoe back, and then going off, scouting. Canoe trips, solo canoe trips, and then off to university. And I thought, well, if I can canoe, I can row. So I became a varsity sculler. And that picture that was of the sculling was actually St. Mary's River in Sault Ste. Marie. that joins Lake Superior to Lake Huron, and so rowing there one summer. And then getting this job at the outfitting business, canoeing and kayaking, there it is, the St. Mary's River, the town of Sault Ste. Marie in the background, the Canadian side of Sault Ste. Marie, and just having that opportunity to with the outfitting, being on the water, not quite daily, but in my free time, and of course, or as a guide, it just. I found my niche in paddlecraft and found.
Can I ask just? I see a question. We've got questions coming in already, and there's maybe one that's worth just posing while you're thinking about the rowing and the sculling. Roger in the US has asked, were you competitive in college in fact in kayaking or rowing or in watercraft?
Yeah, I've kept canoeing and kayaking as non-competitive. But the rowing was a passion of mine, and I rowed varsity at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. It was a university modeled, I think they called it, just before I got there, they called it Little Oxford, and it was one of the last universities in Canada to wear gowns and to focus on rowing and rugby as the two main sports. And so students wore gowns to class. Shortly, I think that ended about 2 years before I got there. I was fortunate. I was a single and double sculler. So I tried the crew boats and enjoyed the team work of a crew boat, but I loved the freedom of a single or a double. And had some good fun rowing, made some great connections. I met my wife at the Trent University Rowing Club.
Oh, I believe that she's going to come up later in the conversation.
Yes, yeah.
So it's, so from Killarney, Georgian Bay, wonderful kayaking in Canadian waters. I am aware that you've had many years in polar regions since. How did you pivot from cold water, I appreciate it must be pretty cold in the Great Lakes in winter, to the real cold down south and up north?
Yeah, interestingly enough, being in Killarney through the winters, of course, I was quite eager for Georgian Bay to thaw in the spring. And I remember the first year I put on a dry suit and trudged out with my kayak to the edge of the ice, and then put the kayak in the water and went for a paddle, and then tried to figure out it was a lot easier getting the kayak off the ice into the water than it was getting it back onto the ice afterwards. I didn't actually think at that time that I would be working in the Antarctic a year later. But one of my clients on a guided trip was a sales and marketing executive for an expedition cruise company, and she said, "Wow, you'd be the right personality to be on a ship coming to the Antarctic. You should apply." And I did. I'm sort of almost ashamed to say it, but I think I handed her a resume about 20 minutes after the trip ended, and it seemed like quite an exciting prospect. And within a few months, my season was over. The outfitting was a seasonal business, and I was on my way to the Amazon River and up the Amazon and then down to the Antarctic for a number of months. And in applying, I didn't really know a lot about it, and I'm almost embarrassed to say it now. I applied initially without having ever been to the Antarctic or knowing anything about expedition cruising. I applied as the expedition leader, and because that seemed like, wow, that's the way to go. And I could see you laughing as a longtime expedition leader yourself. You need a little bit of knowledge to do that job. But I went through that, and I, from there, in that application, to get my sort of resume looked at, I thought, well, I'm going to tell them that they need to do sea kayaking in Antarctica, and here's how they're going to do it. So I put a proposal together, again, without having been to the Antarctic or really even seeing an expedition vessel. And there needed to be some adaptations to it. But that got my resume looked at, got me on the ship, and then slowly I was able to implement a kayaking program. And I found that the Antarctic was it's a place everybody has an opinion about the Antarctic. Not everybody wants to go there, but there's something emotive about Antarctica that every single person that's heard of it has an opinion, and they have a thought about it. And for me, it was this exciting place to be. It was a place to adventure, and a moment in Antarctica leads to a lifetime of adventure for me, anyways.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, I've said it before elsewhere that in a world of 8 billion people, having a continent the size of North America that's not yet been colonized, I think is always worthy of reflection. And as you point out, it's a moment there leads to a lifetime of longing, and so it's an extraordinary place. And I understand that you didn't just go down as a kayak guide. You were a little bit more ambitious on the expeditionary front, exploratory front.
Yeah, it's interesting. We so I worked as on the ship, and my girlfriend at the time, and then she came down. We worked together as partners on the ship, got married, and we worked on the ship for a number of years together. And we decided, well, we hadn't really had a proper honeymoon, and because it was the seasons, and between Arctic and Antarctic seasons, it was hard to squeeze a honeymoon in. And so we decided to actually, in late 2000, to leave the ship by sea kayak and paddle down the length of the peninsula. We didn't really, in our own minds, view it as an expedition. It was more of an adventure for us. It was a trip. It was getting out there and exploring, learning more about the place, enjoying it. And so we did. We were dropped off. We were up for about 12 or 13 nights in late mid-December of 2000 actually. And we got dropped off by ship. We had each in our own sea kayak. We had a satellite phone. We had far too much fuel for our camp stoves, and we left with far too much water. I studied physical geography at university. I knew that Antarctica was a continent covered in fresh water in the form of ice, and so to carry all this fuel to melt snow to get running water, and then to carry all this water in addition, the kayaks were barely floating above the surface at first. And we quickly realized what we needed to change and adapt, and that you don't take running water from below a penguin colony, and a few little things like that. But we spent quite a bit of time paddling down a stretch of the Antarctic Peninsula. I think when we first put on the water and the ship sailed away, it was a ship we'd worked on for part of the season with a team we'd worked with for a couple of seasons at that point. It was there was a feeling of abandonment, a wonderful feeling of abandonment, maybe a little bit of anxiety as well. But that sense of abandonment, and then the vastness of the space, and that the two small kayaks in that large bay, that when you look at it from the ship, Sierra Cove is just a small little cove, really. Yeah. But when the ship sails away and you're just in the kayaks, the immensity of space is a little overwhelming. We paddled out, and my memories of the trip are very fond, are great memories. They're of great weather. And
but you're telling me about this, that in our conversations when we were discussing this episode, it was all about the great weather and the amazing vistas. And I understand that last night at dinner that something turned up that.
Yeah, interestingly enough, it's funny you bring that up. Last night we had a family birthday dinner, and my parents came over for dinner, and my dad mentioned that, or my mom mentioned that they found a copy of a letter we'd sent after the trip, and it was sort of a family letter written as a form of a journal of the voyage, and we'd sent it shortly after we got back off the ship, or got back on the ship. And the next time we were in port, we sent this email. I think there was email in 2000, and it looks like it was email, and and it was interesting. I read that this morning. Quite my dad scanned it and sent it through to me, and I read it this morning. And it's amazing how foul the weather was on the trip. That most nights we barely made it ashore before the weather closed, and that we woke up a number of mornings to find the bay full of ice or complete whiteout conditions. And I'd forgotten some of it. I recalled. We were stuck on an island called Alcock Island in Hughes Bay. And Alcock is open to the Bransfield from the sort of the northeast, and so it's quite exposed. Bransfield Strait is quite an open body of water, and so it's exposed to weather coming in. There was always quite a swell in Hughes Bay. It's not really heavily visited by expedition ships because of that swell. It makes it troublesome to get on and off the Zodiacs or to get ashore on the beaches. there aren't really any beaches in Hughes Bay either. But we got stuck there. The weather closed in. We woke up after our first night camping there, and it was the first day, I think it was visibility weather had closed in. And I'll read what Kathy wrote in our little diary. We ended up spending the most part of 4 days on Alcock Island. We hiked to the top a number of times each day to continuously check the conditions. There was always something that wasn't in our favor. Blowing snow or 30-knot winds, or no visibility from fog, or a 4 to 5 meter ocean swell. And so I remember this stay on Alcock Island, probably not because of the weather, but because during that time I taught Kathy to play rummy. And I'm going to say this live on TV. I won the first 3 games, and she won the next 70 odd games. And a number of years later, we kept a tally. Actually, I'd gotten one of those fancy watches that tells you, does everything with, barometer and altimeter and all that stuff. And I had taken the manual with me, and that was the only piece of paper we had to write on except our nautical chart. And so we kept the tally in the back of the Casio manual, and we found it a number of years later. And the tally was the first 3 games were to me, and the next 70 odd games were to Kathy. So that tested our relationship, I think. I can't.
And I guess this is right in the middle of the summer season, the Antarctic summer season. So I understand you had Christmas down there, and of course our guests, for those watching Viking.TV now, our viewers now who are planning to come with us to the Antarctic in the future, this is right in the middle of the season that we'll be there. And I think just a point you made about that you remember all the fine days, but in reality there's 4 seasons in a day. And that all the photos that everybody ever takes back, all the photos that you ever see in marketing from anywhere or anything, is always of beautiful days. But I could imagine that it was not always the case. How did you spend Christmas there?
Yeah, so interesting, and you make a great point on that. And with the ships, of course, we move to where the weather is better. We can see over the horizon, we've got the weather charts, and we move, but in a kayak, you're stuck. You go to bed in the tent, you wake up in the morning, whatever is happening is the weather you're facing. And so we didn't have that flexibility to change the weather around us by moving. We spent Christmas, we tried to poke out and cross a bay. The wind was blowing, sort of starting at 15 knots, but as you spend time down there, you get to the feeling for what the weather's doing. We could tell it was building. We hid out behind an island to see if the weather was going to drop. It didn't, so we pulled ashore, and by the time we were setting up camp, the wind was blowing 40 knots. And Kathy had written that this was Christmas Eve. Kathy had written that the shovel was almost torn out of my hand as we were digging the hole to set the tent in. A few things we didn't really notice was, and this leads to Christmas morning, was the island islet that we'd landed on was a rock covered in about 2 to 3 meters of snow. And of that 2 to 3 meters of snow in height, we had to dig steps to get up onto the top, and then we dug in. So the tent was completely buried, or there was a hole big enough that the tent was down in it. So the wind was just blowing across the top of the island. It wasn't buffeting the tent all night. If you've slept in a tent in high winds, it's hard to sleep. It wasn't this day of this picture, but that was the one fine day that I have this fond memory of all the days. But we had the tent buried, and in that 2 meters of snow, about 1.5 meters of that snow was actually guano, or heavily snow impregnated with guano. And so we woke up Christmas morning, both of us, with sort of runny eyes and blinding headaches from the smell of the nitrates of the guano. But our stockings had been delivered and were at the foot of our sleeping bags. And so we'd each carried the other person's stocking in the bow of our kayak. And we put those out and we opened the stockings. And I have to confess that there was some Baileys in the hot chocolate that morning as we celebrated Christmas morning. And then we packed up and we had a beautiful paddle across Charlotte Bay. and zero visibility, but glassy, oily, calm conditions. And if you've been on the sea in low visibility with oily, calm conditions, it's a magical thing to see. And you sort of lose the transition between the horizon, or between the sea and the sky. The horizon line becomes indistinct, and so we paddled with a compass fix, and we stopped halfway through to check our GPS position. And the handheld GPSs were fairly new, a few years old at that point, quite expensive, and the software wasn't as intuitive as it is now. So we tended to use that to back check our dead reckoning. And we ended up crossing, and the snow was falling and building up on the deck of the kayak as we got across. A chinstrap penguin decided we were worth following and followed us across Charlotte Bay for about an hour and a half of the crossing, 2 hours of the crossing, and just squawking every once in a while behind us. And that sort of gave us some perspective. And we got across, and we camped out on the tip of I think it's the Recluse Peninsula. And found a nice little campsite. And by the time we got the camp set up, the weather had closed in, and we had blowing sleet, and it was quite an interesting. We just got stuck down there during a low pressure system, and we had turkey tetrazzini, which was a freeze dried sort of a creamed turkey dinner. We had a Tetra pack of red wine to go with that, and that we kept in the bow of a kayak. And so the carton of wine and the turkey tetrazzini and the sleet, and that was also ended up being our last evening ashore in Antarctica.
I'm impressed. I was going to say that when I was working in the Antarctic, a soldier colleague of mine always had very nice food in his rucksack, and commented that when you're camping in the cold places, any fool can suffer. So I think that sounds really good. And the route you took was in the Gerlache Strait, I understand. I think we're going to bring up an image of the map route, a map with a route rather.
Yeah, so we were in the Gerlache Strait, so the northern end of the Gerlache Strait. As you get farther south, and just to the south of us, you find there's more. It's more sheltered by Brabant Island and Anvers Island, so it's better conditions, but there are more ships, and we wanted to be in an area that we hadn't really spent a lot of time visiting with the expedition cruise vessels that we'd been working on to that point. And so we stayed a little further north. We only covered half the distance. We had intended to end up much further south, but the number of nights we had to double up and on Alcock Island, spending 3 nights there, we only got half the distance that we'd intended to cover before we arranged for pickup. We had the satellite phone, and the ship we'd worked on, they were our safety net. So we'd call into the expedition leader every couple of days, touch base. And so Christmas evening, I guess, after our turkey tetrazzini, we called into the ship and got the expedition leader and said, we're much farther north than you're expecting us. But tomorrow's your last day on the peninsula before you head back to Ushuaia. So it's going to have to be tomorrow. When are you passing where we are? And they said, well, 6:30 in the morning. So we got up, I think it was about 4 a.m, and paddled out into the middle of the Gerlache Strait. And it was remarkable. We'd been away from ships and people. We hadn't seen a vapor contrail across the skies. And where we were traveling, we hadn't seen any ships in close. Being in the back of the bays, we hadn't really heard the ship. So as the ship was about 2 to 3 miles from us, we could hear the sound of the engines and the vibration of the ship's propellers as the ship approached us. And it was the most overwhelming noise. It was a Russian scientific research ship turned passenger ship called the Academic Yoffe. And the captain, as he did a big loop around us in the Gerlache Strait, and the captain was out on the wing bridge with a Canadian flag that he was waving over the side, and the expedition leader put a Zodiac down and a clothespin on his nose, and then came over and picked us up, being in sort of polypro and dry suits for 10 days. I think we were 12 days. We were kind of ripe, I think. And he brought us onto the ship. Kathy radioed to the bridge just before the Zodiac came out and said, can you turn the sauna on, have the sauna turned on and warmed up by the time we get back on the ship. We'd had a cold night that last night I think we'd stopped worrying about keeping our gear dry and so on the last day. And the watch officer, a Russian officer, is no problem. And turned the sauna on for us. And we got back into the dining room for breakfast. It was an early morning, 6:30 in the pickup. We got into the dining room for breakfast, and the noise of 100 people eating and talking and normal noise in a dining room was overwhelming to us. The loudest noise we'd heard were penguins or glaciers, the rumblings of mountains, crevasses opening and closing, calving of glaciers, and then our little stove that was sounded a bit like a jet engine. That was about the only unnatural noise we'd heard for the whole time away.
Fantastic. Can I ask, we're going to just bring up the map one more time. I know it's coming up a couple of times, but there was just one thing I wanted to highlight was for our viewers that are familiar with the Viking Expedition voyages, the thumbnail it says the Antarctic Explorer map. That's of the Viking Expedition's Antarctic Explorer voyage from Ushuaia down to the peninsula, just to sort of orientate. For those that wanted to just work out where in the peninsula we were, and I can imagine that it was it was very formative. What would you say would be the things that you learned from that most sort of that have carried you since, for the 20 years since that you've been running a myriad expeditions since in the Antarctic?
Yeah, I think one point that came up was, of course, we don't control the weather. We don't take responsibility for the weather. You take responsibility for how you deal with the weather, but not, I've never stood up there as an expedition leader or a kayak guide and said, you're welcome for the beautiful day, nor have I blamed people for the foul weather. How you deal with the weather is another story. And I think I learned that you can accomplish your goals despite the weather with the right mindset. And that's something I've always tried to instill in staff on ships, but also in the guests that come to the region, that this is Antarctica. This is, you take what you get and you smile because you're getting it. It's amazing. You're going to the Antarctic, so you may as well experience what has challenged people and protected the region. I think and that sort of leads into the safety and risk assessment. As an operations manager, and I have been for a long time, and an expedition leader for a long time, a big part of my job, I turn my brain on in the morning thinking about risk and safety. How safe is it to get out of bed? How risky is it to stay in bed? And and that's the job of an operations manager, and that's what I bring to developing the programs that I do with Viking, thinking about the kayaking program. And so being out there and exposed without any support behind you is what helped to train that mindset. So I've taken that away from this trip. Teamwork is a big part of it. There's a picture of Kathy and I on top of Alcock Island, smiling early in our forced confinement to this island. And I think the next picture probably shows. I think it might be me sitting in the blowing snow at about the same spot on top of this island, not quite smiling as much, but dealing with the weather, and realizing that you as a team we worked well together, and I sort of led that through. Funny, we have very few photos of that trip, and that's something that I learned, that you have to take the memories with your mind rather than always taking the memories with your cameras, and telling our guests to put down the camera for a few moments and just look and absorb, because the photo might not be what you want it to take, or it might never be as good as you think it's going to be, but the memory will always be strong. And so that's another experience I took away from it.
Oh, fantastic. And so hearing about your expeditionary adventures and that extended period of time away, do you have to, for our viewers who may be enthusing now about paddling in polar regions, do you have to be an expedition kayaker in order to enjoy paddling down there?
No, no, you don't. And of course, this was what I'm discussing as our trip. You know, Kathy and I we were dropped off. There were very few multi-day kayak expeditions before us. I think only 2 before us in the Antarctic. So that was an expedition and completely separate from, you know, kayaking in Antarctica on an expedition cruise vessel. We'll get up in the morning on the ship, we'll enjoy breakfast, we'll get a briefing, we'll have an update on the weather, and then we'll decide, are we kayaking this morning? We'll communicate that to our guests. We'll get out in the kayaks for an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes. We provide much better dry suits than we had on our own expedition 20 years ago. The technology has changed. The prices have come down dramatically. For us in our early 20s, mid 20s, you know, the price of a dry suit was half a season's salary. So we didn't invest in the best dry suits, but we have that for our guests on the ship, and then we've controlled that, where we have more control, not of the weather, but of what we do in the weather that's around us. So you don't need to be an expedition kayaker. However, when you leave the ship and you go back home, having been an expedition kayaker is a great story to tell. And we do allow a little bit of leeway on weather. That, you know, if it was 5 knots, that automatically, I think the 10 knot rule is a good one. You can always add 10 knots to the conditions you kayaked in for your friends and family. Unless you're telling your mom, then you subtract 10 knots from the conditions you paddled in.
And knock 10 degrees off the temperature, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. You've been there.
Yeah. And can you tell us more about what our plans are, and specifically as you're leading on how the evolving of Viking Expeditions kayak program?
Yeah, so the kayak industry has been fairly stable. Their kayaking programs in Antarctica have been fairly stable over the last 20 years. I was sort of the lead guide in setting up the first mainstream operation on an expedition cruise vessel and 4 kayaks in 1999, and now the entire on one ship. And now almost every operator in the industry has kayaks on board the ship, and of variations on the theme. Most of the operations are fairly similar. You know, there are a few variations between companies. Viking has come into this with let's look at the problem. Is there a problem? Let's look at it, and then let's think innovatively about how we can address some of these things. So I'll take you into a kayak, and a kayak is sleek. It's fairly tippy. It's got a bit of initial instability at times. There's a cockpit that you're sitting down into, and you've got a paddle in your hands, and you use that paddle to propel. You use it to stabilize you if conditions are choppy. If you want to take a picture, use binoculars. You put your paddle down on your lap and you take the pictures. If you're with someone in a double, then that person can help propel you. If you're taking advantage of that person, then you create some friction in that double because you're taking a lot of pictures and they're doing a lot of work paddling and propelling the craft. If you're paddling with a group and you keep taking pictures, you fall behind the group. And so it affects the group dynamics, and you've got the guide chasing you to, can you keep with the group, the safety in numbers, all those little group management. Well, those are sort of the problems traditionally with kayaking, how it's been done on the expedition cruise vessels. So I was really excited to join Viking after the decision was made, but to jump into this program because the answer was there in front of me. And Viking selected a pedal drive kayak, a Hobie Mirage drive pedal drive kayak. And this image shows, many of you who have been watching Viking.TV would recognize Alistair Miller, our photographer in residence, sitting in the stern of that kayak. He's got his camera in his hand, and Bill in the front with binoculars, and they're moving their kayak. They're propelling their kayak. They're not arguing with each other because they're taking pictures and getting behind the group. And so what you see is a sit-on-top kayak, so easy to get into, with a comfortable seat and a revolutionary propulsion. And so I think we'll try to show you a little more of the details of that kayak, because I think it's great. The stability is there. It's wide and fairly flat bottomed. It's got these propulsion. Each peddler. I've had to change my vocabulary around kayaking. Each peddler kayaker has a foot pedal that's easily adjustable. Just by leaning forward, you can adjust the foot pedals. And then you've got this beautiful seat that has an adjustable seat back that elevates you a little bit. With the increased stability of the boat, that doesn't affect your overall stability. And then this pedal drive system is in its essence is very Antarctic. The design of the pedal drive was taken from the concept of a penguin's flippers and how a penguin propels itself through the water, moving its flippers. And so there's an Antarctic connection to the kayaks we've chosen. What does this mean for us? It means our guests can sit down on top of a kayak without climbing into the cockpit, easily adjust the foot pedals, and then just pedal in a back and forth motion with their feet as they're propelling the kayaks. And generally, there's about a 20% increase in efficiency with that pedaling system rather than using a two-bladed paddle, all things being equal. So the boat's going to move a little faster with less effort. And so that really opens up the ability to use the kayaks for a wider group of people. I'm really excited by this. It's completely different than what is being done. And I see it as time for a change. That it's one thing to keep doing or copy what other people are doing. It's another thing to think creatively and innovate.
Well, can I ask, actually, as you're discussing that pedal motion, we have some more questions coming in, and we have one from Amos in Malibu, and who has asked, how fit do you need to be to do kayak excursions?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you for it, Amos. Well, if you're a comfortable walker, then you should be comfortable at pedaling these kayaks. On the ship, the guides are accessible. They can talk to you in person and assess and let you know what they think, how comfortable you're going to be in the kayak. The design of the boat, the choice of the boat, is designed to appeal to the widest range of fitness types, body types, comfort, on-water comfort levels. And then from that point, our guides who are right there on the ship with you, who would be leading the excursion, will be available prior to excursions throughout the course of a voyage to actually answer your questions and ensure that you're fit and able, or perhaps suggest another activity if your mobility isn't quite sufficient or your comfort isn't there.
And the as you were saying about that sort of the fitness side, but also how about guest preparation? How do they prepare? How would they prepare for an excursion?
Yeah, and that's a great point as well. And so I've talked about the kayaks, of course, and we'll provide those. You don't have to bring those in your luggage with you. The dry suits will also provide, and a personal flotation device or a life jacket. It's kayak specific. It's designed, the back is cut so that it doesn't get in the way of the seat back, and and the arms are there so you can get your binoculars up quickly and your camera. And we do provide paddles if you do need them. There would be a paddle tethered to the side of each kayak. So if you decide you want to paddle as well as pedal to get away from the guides, I'm not recommending that, then you have that there. Underneath the dry suit, you'd have an insulating layer, a liner suit. We provide that. And so what we ask you to bring is basically a thick pair of socks and your thermals, what you'd wear under your foul weather gear, your outer layer for excursions. So that thermal underlayer, thick socks, and then put our liner suit over top of that, and then the dry suit on. You bring your own beanie or toque, as we call them in Canada, and you can see these folks. It looks like Karina in the bow of that kayak dressed to paddle in Antarctica. I think that might be in Seattle, perhaps in the winter, but it's about the same outfit that you'd wear in the Antarctica. The dry suit, which is your waterproof outer layer. It's got a neck gasket and wrist gaskets, built-in socks. And then a pair of either rubber boots or neoprene boots over top to protect your feet, protect the bottom of the dry suit and keep you warm. And then the life jacket. And then you've got the person and the gentleman in the stern is wearing a beanie, a toque, and Karina's wearing a baseball cap in the front. And that's really, in Antarctica, you might be wearing a baseball cap to keep the sun out of your eyes. And you might have a toque tucked inside your life jacket. Pull it out, put it on top of your baseball cap to keep your ears warm as you're paddling or pedaling.
And when you're paddling around, is there any escort? Is there any support vessel around? Yeah,
so what we've planned is that there'll be kayak guides on the water in kayaks with guests. Interpreting, leading, guiding, and then as the shepherds, I guess you could say, corralling the group together. There's icebergs rolling, collapsing, ice faces collapsing. There's wildlife, curious wildlife. There's also, of course, a very stringent set of guidelines that we follow in terms of our behavior around Antarctic wildlife. So our guides are there to teach those guidelines and the reasons for those guidelines. And then we also escort the group with an empty Zodiac, just a driver and a Zodiac. And that way, if someone's uncomfortable, miserable for some reason, needs to run back to the ship, get back to the ship to go to the loo, whatever it might be, they can bail out into that Zodiac and be taken back to the ship. Or if the weather changes, we can use that Zodiac there to help us corral the kayaks, wrap up the excursion and get people back to the ship quickly. It's all about flexibility, and that's what we provide with the system of guides and escort Zodiac.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I was going to say that we've been discussing kayaking in an Antarctic context now for a few minutes, and so it's been quite focused on the Antarctic. However, Viking Expeditions is also developing Arctic and Great Lakes itineraries. And so we'd like at this moment just to show a very short video about one of our itineraries in the Great Lakes. It's called the Great Lakes Explorer Voyage. And I'd hope, Aaron, you'd be able to speak a bit about paddling in the Great Lakes.
Certainly.
Embark on a voyage of discovery through the natural wonders of North America's Great Lakes with Viking. Your enriching journey begins in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a revitalized city that mixes the contemporary with icons from its industrial past. A favorite district is the historic Third Ward, where brick warehouses, once filled with the businesses of Italian immigrants, have beautifully transformed into a vibrant neighborhood. From Milwaukee, your Viking ship sets sail across Lake Michigan for Mackinac Island, a delightful window into a bygone era, where horse-drawn carriages are the preferred mode of transportation in this sleepy, carless village. Then it's on to Canada to explore the quaint towns of Little Current and Parry Sound, nestled into the shores of Georgian Bay. The bay itself is a place of legend, its many islands said to have been created by the god Kichikawana, who, after a beautiful princess broke his heart, grabbed a fistful of earth and hurled it into the azure waters where it broke apart. Your purpose-built Viking vessel is an ideal base from which to explore and learn. A floating classroom sharing the science behind the fascinating ecosystems you're sailing through. And your expedition-class ship is equipped with watercraft, so you can investigate intriguing shorelines up close whenever possible. The opportunities are plentiful, including at Killarney, Ontario, where you can soak up the striking scenery that inspired the Group of Seven, a collection of Canadian artists in the early 20th century who started the country's first national art movement to forever honor Canada's majestic landscapes. Next up, the impressive Sioux Locks, known as the linchpin of the Great Lakes. They make it possible to effortlessly traverse the 21-foot difference in water levels between Lake Huron and Lake Superior. Your extraordinary journey concludes in Thunder Bay, Ontario, where an overnight stay gives you time to set out into its verdant forests. Step back into the days of the fur traders at a living museum. Gaze upon natural features at Sleeping Giant Provincial Park, and much, much more. There is perhaps no better place to complete your exploration of some of North America's most majestic waterways.
Well, I do hope you've enjoyed our video short about this exciting itinerary. And one of the highlights of the itinerary is spending a few days in Georgian Bay. And Aaron, you have your guiding background at the Killarney Outfitters there. Can you tell us about what it's like to be kayaking on the Great Lakes?
Yeah, I certainly can, and I was hoping you'd ask that because it's one of the most incredible places in the world to kayak, to paddle anything really. Georgian Bay is an inland sea. It's the side of Lake Huron, and it's an inland sea that is scattered with thousands of islands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of islands. And those islands are separated. They're small channels, flat water. It's fresh water, of course. It's a lake, freshwater lake. So there's no tides. There's no barnacles. And so you don't have to worry about currents. An ocean kayaker thinking on the ocean is thinking about getting in before the tide changes, about scratching their boat on the barnacles or walking in their bare feet across the barnacles on the shore. Those are not considerations you have paddling on the Great Lakes. But beside that, it's a landscape scoured by glaciers, created by glaciers. The last glaciation was about 15,000 years ago, and that has left the rocks strided or striped or scoured by the glaciers, by water, by wind. And so these windswept islands with these windswept pine trees on them are absolutely fantastic to paddle around. I'm passionate about that area. I cut my teeth guiding on Georgian Bay, and it's the most sensational place. Whether we kayak in a sea kayak, here's a narrow channel between a couple of islands from the cockpit of a sea kayak, and these channels, and you finish that channel, you turn right or left at the end, and you go through another set of channels. It's going to be a lot easier to go back there with a GPS rather than having to dead reckon with a map and chart and compass, trying to figure out exactly which island I'm passing now. It'll be almost too easy, but it's really quite spectacular. And you can be out there on the water in a sea kayak or in one of our kayaks. But we're also we'll be working with the local tour operators in the areas to incorporate some of the traditional canoes of the region. And Killarney itself was called Shebananing, a safe canoe passage, and it was a stop on the fur trading route. And so the big canoes, the 10 and 12 person fur trading canoes, would go through that area. So perhaps there will be an opportunity to get in one of those canoes. Or Killarney itself is the community as a neighbor to Killarney Provincial Park, one of the crown jewels of the Ontario park system. And Killarney Park is again windswept pine trees, pink granites on the south side of the park, and then white quartzite mountains through the rest of the park, and crystal clear waters. This is a place that inspired the Group of Seven, the famous Canadian landscape artists. And so getting into that park with the Killarney Mountain Lodge with their canoes, and getting into the park and exploring the park by canoe the day we're in Killarney is another option on the list. So I can't say enough. I do go on for hours about paddling.
Well, it's wonderful to hear your enthusiasm, and if you had to capture the essence of kayaking, I think we have a couple of images we'd like to bring up. So you might want to speak to a couple of these images of just how you distill the essence of remote kayaking in expeditionary way.
Yeah, well, I love this image, and this is a friend of mine, Jeff Topham, is a professional photographer, and he came down on the ship with me while I was guiding, and had and he is just, I think he captures people and expressions and color. And the thing I love about this is, as I think back to Kathy and I, our expedition and the foul weather we had, I don't think of that weather. I think of the experiences, the positive experiences, and it's all blue sky, calm weather days in my memory. And that's really what kayaking in Antarctica or in the Arctic or on the Great Lakes is going to be. You might have the bad weather, but the memories are going to be powerful, and the experience is what is going to create the memory. So, those two paddlers were smiling through the snow falling on them, and then I think the other side of it is it's the majesty of the place of these destinations and what you see in these destinations. You're in your own craft. It's the only time you get to call yourself the captain is when you're in the kayak. If you do that on the ship, Captain Olivier might get a little offended. So I would wait till you're in the kayak to call yourself captain. But you get to be in control of your own sense of place where you are in the Antarctic, or in this case in the Arctic, or on the Great Lakes, and experience that. And it's really from the deck of a kayak, the view is completely different than it is from the deck of a ship or a motorboat or a Zodiac, whatever other platform you're on.
Fantastic. Well, Aaron, I mean, it's been a revelation. It's lovely to be discussing your experience with kayaks, and your enthusiasm is infectious. And I do hope that our viewers are enjoying that too. And we have lots of questions coming in, and so at this point, would you be willing to answer a few questions? I'm going to pose. So first of all, we have Roger from the US. Is there a different sort of kayak in icy water? Does it have to be ice strengthened?
It's a great question, and kayaks are made of various materials, from carbon fiber to Kevlar to fiberglass, to a few different sort of thermoform plastics, to a rotomolded polyethylene, which is, and I use that as the last case. Rotomolded polyethylene is a plastic, a very hard plastic material. So we've chosen rotomolded kayaks, polyethylene kayaks, because they're the most durable in the conditions we're going to use them on, which is in icy waters and brashy waters. We don't want to run into a lot of ice. Some of the images I showed you, we were paddling through ice, and while it's neat to look at in the picture, it's not a lot of fun when you're in the boat bashing your kayak through the ice. But the boats can withstand that. But it also protects them from coming up on shore, so you're not so worried about running the boat onto the beach. So we've chosen kayaks that are best capable for all the conditions we'll encounter.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to now pose another one for you here. We have Tara from the UK. Says, hello, am I right to assume the learning curve for paddling a canoe is steeper at first than for a kayak? And I guess we've got also the Viking Hobie as well to discuss there.
Yeah, so very good question, Tara. And if you're talking to a traditional canoe guide, he would tell you that kayakers are people who haven't figured out how to paddle a canoe, and so they use a double-bladed paddle in a kayak. If you talk to a traditional kayak guide, a kayak guide will tell you that a canoe guide is probably someone, or a canoeist is someone who doesn't have the imagination to use a double-bladed paddle and explore further afield. The canoe. The actual motion of paddling a canoe is fairly easy. You're sitting a little higher up, so your stability is a little less certain. It's still great. Canoes are incredible craft, but it's really steering the canoe that's, if you're paddling on one side and someone at the other end is paddling on the other side, it's coordinating so that you keep the canoe going in a straight line. And that's really when you see beginner canoeists go out on a lake, they tend to go in circles, and while they're going in circles, there's a lot of arguing going on between the bow and the stern seat. In a kayak, that's not quite the same issue. When you add in the mirage drive, the pedal drive, it's even easier because everybody knows how to walk and push their legs back and forth, and that's what you're doing in that kayak. So you're pushing it back and forth. Then the steering just comes up to cooperation. Each seat has controls for the rudder, and so you have to communicate and cooperate with each other. in order to go in the direction you want to go. And then it's an exercise in communication rather than skill.
That's fantastic. Well, actually, I have a full-on question from Tommy in San Diego. Asks, I am building on the point you've just made, I think. I love the idea of having free hands while kayaking. What a neat new type of kayak. Are you strapped in, and do you have to learn the Eskimo swing before you can use these?
Yeah, so great question, and you're not strapped in per se. You're seated in a kayak, and you've got sort of the foot pedals. Your feet are just under a stirrup, if you will, on the foot pedal to hold your foot in position on the pedal so it doesn't slide off. And then you're seated in the seat. And that gives you enough positive with your butt on the seat and your back against the seat back, and then your feet on the pedals. That gives you enough positive push points to hold you in comfortable in the seat. You do not need to know a Greenlandic roll and I doubt it would be possible to do in these kayaks. The paddle is a very key component of doing a roll unless you're a very skilled roller, and I can't imagine there's many people who have tried to roll a sit on top kayak like that. They're designed so that you don't need that. They're designed to be more stable and comfortable. These were designed as fishing or angling kayaks, and so if you can imagine standing up to cast or using a net to pull a fish in, you need that stability. So we've chosen kayaks that are stable so that our guests are most comfortable and don't need to learn the roll before they come to the ship.
Well, I mean, that's very reassuring. In fact, a follow-on question here from Phil in Boston says, I have never been in a kayak. Should I find somehow how to experience it before coming on a Viking expedition in February 22?
And that too is a great question, and it's not a mandatory part of our system that you have to have had prior experience. The way I'd answer that is if you can find a place to get out in a kayak, especially if you can get out in a Hobie or in a pedal drive kayak, then take advantage of that, because kayaking is just a wonderful thing to do anywhere you go. But and I'm somewhat biased on that. But the other point of it, of course, is that if you're a little more comfortable in that boat, you'll get a little more out of your experience when you're down in the Antarctic or up in the Arctic or on the Great Lakes paddling. So that'll enhance the experience you have, just having that little extra familiarity with it. You don't need the experience of paddling if you're from a warm weather place. You don't have to go out and find a dry suit and put that on. It really, but if you can get a bit of time in a kayak beforehand, I think it just offers and enhances the experience you'll have.
Sounds like it generally enhances life.
Yeah, I would say so.
Another question here from John in New York in the US. This may be a concern of some of our viewers. It says, have you ever been toppled over by a whale or other marine animal while kayaking? Is that something that should be a worry?
I personally have not. I've had some incredible experiences. I lost a race down in the Antarctic once. Well, my story is that a whale surfaced, a humpback surfaced right behind me, and my paddle almost got stuck in its blowhole. And there was no one close enough to refute that. The guy who beat me was a South African Eco Challenge racer, and I think it might have had something to do with his physique and fitness as to why he won, not the whale. But my story stands. I've had some incredible experiences. I've had whales bubble net. Humpback whales do their bubble net below me and spin around below me in different parts of the world. And that's interesting when you're paddling in one direction and there's this massive sort of vortex of water and your boat spins in the other direction. I mean, that's incredible to experience. I've never felt endangered by them. We tend to take a precautionary approach, and that is if there's wildlife around us, then we bring the kayaks together. We want to minimize our impact on the wildlife. We want to make sure they know where we are so they can stay clear of us. And if we need to, then we can back away. Trust me, we'll get an incredible experience from as close as the guides allow you to be. But we do have guidelines that we have to follow to minimize our impact. I haven't really, there have been a few cases here and there of kayaks being involved with whales in ways that were somewhat catastrophic for the kayak. But for the most part, the whales are very aware of their surroundings, and our guides are very good at directing the group and anticipating the behavior of the whales. It's part of why you want a guide with you in these regions, is because they have that familiarity.
Absolutely. I'm continuing to get questions here. I've picked out two more just to cover in the time that we have. Firstly, Madeline in Virginia asks, what itineraries on Viking expeditions can you kayak on?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Madeline. We offer kayaking as part of our program, part of our expedition program on all of our itineraries. So in the Antarctic, it's a great part of the program. Up in the Arctic as well, the kayak is a craft that has evolved from the hunting culture in the Arctic with the Inuit in Greenland. And then on the Great Lakes, also a great. We have 3 itineraries on the Great Lakes, and one of those itineraries has multiple days on Georgian Bay, 3 days on Georgian Bay, the Great Lakes Explorer. So that's going to have an incredible paddling. One of the itineraries, the Undiscovered Great Lakes, is 4 days on Lake Superior, which is one of the largest lakes in the world. And it is the largest of the Great Lakes. So lots of opportunity to paddle on those voyages. And then our other itinerary, Niagara in the Great Lakes, takes us through 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. So that really, if you can't find paddling opportunities on 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, well, that'd be surprising. So all of our itineraries are designed with the expedition focus in order to deliver that.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to finish here with a question from Alan from Myrtle Beach in the US. And I feel it's appropriate to ask someone whose so much of their career has been shaped by kayaks. And it's, is there an expedition in the future you would consider the ultimate kayak challenge? That's a tough one to finish on their own.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the ultimate kayak challenge, not necessarily one that I haven't done. It's been done before. I've spent a lot of time in the Arctic, and especially in the Canadian Arctic, and I would love to paddle through the Northwest Passage. It's not something I've really voiced a lot, but it's something in the back of my head that would be an incredible journey to do. There's so much of the world. I've been fortunate with my work in expedition cruising to see so much of the world. I've paddled in so many incredible places that I could list 100 such epic expeditions that I would like to do, and we'll see parts of them on many of our itineraries going forward as I try to sneak in a little bit of influence here and there with, well, this is a great place to paddle, we need to go there, and I can be persuasive at times. So, but yeah, the Northwest Passage is one of those spots. You've got the history of the region, you've got the people, the hardiness of the people that have survived up in that area for thousands of years, and then you've got the challenges of weather and ice and polar bears, of course. So if I had to pick one, it would be the Northwest Passage.
I think it's highly appropriate for a Canadian. But I can see questions continuing to roll in, but noting the time, I feel we've kept you talking now for over an hour, and to our viewers, thank you so much for taking interest in what we're developing on our kayak program. And Aaron, thank you for sharing your experiences and your enthusiasm and your knowledge and what you're doing developing the program with the expedition team. I think it's can't wait. So thank you, and I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, no, my great pleasure, and it's I mean, it's a wonderful thing as you know, Damon, as a longtime Antarctic hand yourself, and everybody on the team is very passionate about the places we travel, and so to have this opportunity and the interest of our viewers to sit in and listen and us share our stories about the places we love, it's exciting. So we'll look forward to seeing you folks on a ship in the polar regions or in the Great Lakes at some point in the future, and we'll encourage you to keep the questions coming as you have them. And we'll hope to see you adventuring at some place, either on the Great Lakes, Antarctic, or the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you. Till next time.